Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 300. Thank you for joining us. Today, Nick Senz and Brendan Murphy return to the Kolbecast. In addition to the many other things that these gentlemen do, they are also theology teachers with Kolbe Academy. In addition to teaching, Nick is also the author of Kolbe's new 10th grade theology text, Mystery and Grace. We discuss this new book and its development, but also get to hear both Nick and Brendan's wisdom in teaching students about the sacraments. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
Stephen, how are you today?
Doing very well. It's been a productive day and looking forward to our conversation this afternoon.
Oh, nice. Yes, I'm very glad to hear that. Yeah, we've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a long time. We are excited to announce the publication by Kolbe Academy Press of a book written by longtime Kolbe teacher Nick Senz, who also serves as a theology department chair. His book, Mystery and Grace, The Sacramental Life, gives students a solid foundation in theology and spiritual life by delving into the beauty and mystery of the sacraments, prayers, and liturgical year. He's here with us today, along with Brendan Murphy, one of Kolbe's theology teachers and a longtime catechist himself, as well as homeschooling dad, among so many other things, both these guys, to discuss the book and give us some practical insights on how Kolbe's theology courses, which are grounded in the transformative truths of the Catholic faith, serve as both academic opportunities and conduits of deepening one's relationship with God. Welcome back, you two.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thanks.
So last time we got to visit with you was episode 218, along with Dan Angel, another one of the theology teachers. Let's do some catching up. Nick, let's start with you. How are things going?
Going well. Very excited about the book coming out finally in a printed form. It was very exciting to get that in the mail and see the official stamp of approval from the bishop. It's been good.
I can only imagine that has to be among the great sort of euphoric feelings like that of all. That's got to rank right up there, I would think. It's just what a process. I'd love to hear more about that. So I'm going to ask you about that. We'll come back to that here in a little bit later. What about you, Brendan?
Doing well. I think since the last time, sent another child to college. So we have 5 kids. Our oldest is a sophomore at St. Bonaventure University, and our one and only daughter, is a freshman at DeSales University and doing great with the Salesians there. And actually was really excited to let us know the other day she's now officially a student athlete, which caught us all off guard. She got into running on the treadmill and she was really getting good at it. And one of her friends is on the track team, said, "You should talk to the track coach." And the track coach gave her a spot. So we're pretty excited about that. So hopefully she'll train with them in the winter, and then in the spring she'll compete. So we're looking forward to that. That was not something I didn't have that on my my bingo board of life experiences. I had no idea this was going to happen. So this will be pretty cool.
That's fantastic. It's great. We have very, very limited experience with track events and track meets. And so my hat is off to her and you and everybody working on that. That's great. You guys have each explained this to us on your previous episodes, which we'll link in our notes. But for the listeners who are meeting you for the first time, Nick, tell us about your various things that you do outside of Kolbe.
My full-time job is as a pastoral associate at a parish where I live in Indiana. And people will ask sometimes, what does a pastoral associate do? And I tell them it's kind of like being the utility infielder. You just kind of get plugged into wherever the pastor needs you to do things. So between myself and another pastoral associate on staff, we just divvy up a number of things at the parish, whether it's leading OCIA or helping to plan funerals or anything else that the pastor says, "Hey, I need you to take care of this or take charge of this ministry." I've written occasionally for different Catholic websites and periodicals and things like that. I don't know how deep down the well you want
That's
to go
great.
here.
Yeah. Brendan, tell us about you.
Well, I've kind of simplified it this year. With my increased responsibility at Kolbe, I kind of cut back. I was DRE at a parish for a number of years. I stepped back from that this year, but I still volunteer as I teach 8th graders confirmation. 8th grade is the age we confirm in the Diocese of Scranton. So in our little rural parish, I teach confirmation prep there. But like I said, I've done DRE work in the past, and for 11 years I worked in the office for evangelization for the Diocese of Scranton. That was my first life in the church here, once upon a time.
Okay. It's interesting to me how you bring all these things to bear in your work with the Kolbe students, and also how your Kolbe experience informs your work in these other spheres as well. I like hearing the stories that you share from all that. So good deal. Okay. So we're going to talk about sacraments today. The book that we're discussing, Mystery and Grace, is now one of the textbooks in the Theology 10 course that our Kolbe students take. It's not just for that course, though, as we're going to hear. So let's start big picture, sacraments as a cornerstone of the Catholic tradition. Nick, how do you like to introduce the topic of sacraments?
I often think of it, I often start teaching it. I think I started the book this way. We're unique amongst all of God's creatures, human beings. There are things in creation that are purely material or physical, things like rocks, plants, animals. There are creatures of God that are purely spiritual, like the angels, but human beings are both. We are physical and spiritual. We are ensouled bodies or embodied souls. We have a foot in each camp. And so when God wants to give us the gift of a share in his own life, which we call grace, when he wants to give us this spiritual gift, he gives it to us in a way that's fitting to the sort of critters he made us to be, right? He gives it to us through a physical means, through a physical instrumentality. And that's what the sacraments are. These tangible, physical, sensible signs that actually do what they signify, right? They represent and at the same time actually accomplish giving us God's grace in a way that we can understand, in a way that is again fitting to the sort of creature that God made us as. So that's I think a good kind of helpful starting point to understanding what the sacraments are and what their purpose is in the Christian life. It's God giving us his grace in a way that's fitting to what we are.
Brendan, how do you like to begin that conversation, or what would you add to that?
Well, Nick crushed it, so I don't really have much to add to that. It's just, I think sometimes with the students, we teach it in 10th grade. So they're familiar already with the concept, right? Like they've received several of the sacraments by the time they get to 10th grade. Some of them have received all 30 sacraments of initiation, et cetera. But I think they're almost, I don't want to say too comfortable with the sacraments, or just too familiar that they kind of lose sight of like the awesomeness of them in a sense. So that's one of my favorite things, is when we have these discussions in class that they're like, oh, I really never knew that. Like the sacrament that by far I get the most conversation and random questions on is baptism, which is like the one of the most basic one, like the ones that they first receive, right? Everyone receives that first. And it leads to such all these incredible questions. And it's like, they never fully unpacked it before. That's always pretty exciting. But I really have nothing to add to Nick's spot on description there.
That is interesting, though. The not curiosity, but the how baptism stands out to them. What might you attribute that to?
I think they're fascinated with, form and matter, and what you can use to validly baptize and what you can't. The fact that they could baptize if it was an emergency situation. What about people who die and aren't baptized, and their fate? And how does that all work? And it just leads to these but what about iced tea, where it's mainly water, and it's like all sorts of they've tried to find all these things. Can I use a puddle? These kinds of things. And it just, I don't know, it just gets their wheels turning for whatever reason. And since that's the first one we do, I think it kind of primes them moving forward in the semester and through Nick's book to be more on the alert and more attentive to the other sacraments as well, as we go through and ask questions that they didn't either cover at home, or if they're in a parish CCD setting. Like I teach confirmation in our parish every week, and they ask totally different kinds of questions than the Kolbe kids ask, and so it's just I think when they start hearing the I mean, a lot of them didn't get prepared for baptism. Obviously, they're infants. So I think it's kind of, for some of them, it's the first time they've ever really thought about it, or had anyone explain it to them, to be honest with you. Because everyone, in a parish setting, to begin ready for first penance and first communion and confirmation, you don't really prepare someone unless they're in OCIA for baptism. So I think that's part of the reason they have so many questions about that one in particular. But I do notice it sets a good tone for the rest of the semester with asking lots and lots of questions about the other sacraments that they maybe are a little more familiar with.
One thing that I find is also helpful in teaching about the sacraments, especially with our students, as they're at the age they're at, they're encountering different terms in the life of the church, and they'll hear a term like modernism, and not always understand what it actually means or what the historical referent is there, and they'll think, oh, like anything modern is modernism. I said, no, that's not what it's talking about. Modernism refers to a number of heretical positions coming out of like Enlightenment philosophy. And I borrow this phrase from my friend, Father Harrison Eyre. He says, you can really boil it down to the denial of mediation. So modernism has to do with anything that has to do with saying, well, God couldn't give us his grace through physical things, or God couldn't reveal himself through words in a sacred text. So really, these are just human ways of trying to reach for God, but not God actually reaching down to us. So I find that that's a useful foil to use. There's a mindset out there that says things like, baptism is just us celebrating the fact that we are children of God. No, God is actually doing something in baptism. God is actually using this pouring of water and the speaking of these words, the words that Jesus gave us, to give us his own life. Something's actually happening here. So I find that's a kind of a helpful thing for people.
Sure. Yeah. So in your setting up of the discussion of learning about sacraments, studying the sacraments, the idea of matter and form are right there at the forefront, of course, integral to the discussion. Is that difficult for people to kind of accept the importance that's placed on matter and form?
I mean, I think they find it to be, it makes sense. I mean, when we remind them that all the sacraments go back to Christ, I mean, that's why I always tie it to, like, we don't mess around with what Jesus gives us, basically. And when it's not a human creation. So it makes a lot of sense. We talk about the problems that happen when you mess around with those things, right? I mean, I could be wrong about this. I think it was the Diocese of Detroit. It made the news a few years ago. There's a young priest. He was home with his family. He's like, hey, wouldn't it be great to watch my baptism? And he watches baptism. They use the wrong words. And suddenly it's a crisis, right? Because everything's invalid now. So, they're like, wow, yeah, I never thought about that. Like, yeah, it's really important. I try to break it easily to the girls in the class, because every romantic comedy, the couple writes their own vows. And I'm like, you can't do that. Just like you can't change. So just preparing you can't change your vows. Just like you don't change the words of baptism is the exact same reason why. It's, you need the proper form matter to ensure that this actually takes place, that this is something that is important. It's something that's real. It's something that comes from God. And that's why we don't, that seems to register. I don't really get I personally in the classroom don't get any pushback on that. If anything, I get like, oh, I never really thought about that. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, if Jesus gave it to you, how would you improve anything Jesus does? I think that makes sense to a 10th grade mind.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I think when you start out by explaining that the matter, the physical stuff that we're using in the sacraments has a natural connection with the spiritual realities that are taking place in the sacraments, that helps them to understand, why does it need to be water in baptism? Well, because what's happening in baptism, we are being cleansed of sin, born into new life, we're dying with Christ and rising with him. So water is a fitting sign for that reality, because when you're born, there's water. We use water to cleanse and to wash. Water naturally made ancient peoples, especially, think of death, right? For them, water equaled chaos. It meant floods and drowning. So water is a fitting sign for that. And iced tea, not so much, right? You wouldn't make the natural connection using iced tea or Diet Coke or motor oil or anything else. So once you kind of start there and they say, okay, so I see why it would have to be that. And you get the occasional, which I like, the good probing questions where a student will ask something like, Well, couldn't you use milk? Because isn't milk mostly water? And then you've got a good opportunity to get into some metaphysics. Well, no, because milk is made of water. Water's a part of it, but milk is milk. It's not water, it's milk. It's a different thing, right? It's a different kind of substance. Just like you are mostly water, but I couldn't baptize somebody by throwing you on top of their head. It wouldn't work. So, you've got your standard jokes that you recycle every year.
Do you run into, I mean, because the form and the matter of the sacraments are so important, and there are certain things that need to be said and certain matter that needs to be used. But do you also encounter kind of the opposite of almost like students viewing it as like some sort of magical ritual where, overly maybe concerned about details that aren't important, or thinking that we're doing this rather than this is God acting through these things? Is that a common problem?
I see that. Yeah. Do you see that, Brendan?
I don't see that too often, but I do see like when they don't, I do see sometimes confusion between validity, something being valid and invalid versus licit or illicit when it comes to the celebration of the sacraments, as opposed to this magical understanding of it. So that's what I see often. So I have to explain, well, even the church says like there's certain things that are not essential, like an emergency situation, you can dispense with these, but this part is essential. This is what you need to really focus on. And so we really focus on those things, the right proper form of matter for intention, for validity. There's some other things that are part of the rite, RITE, that are good. But if they mess with those things, it could be illicit, but it's still valid, and that tends to be the things I have to clarify more than, for lack of a better term, an overly magical interpretation of the sacraments, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I was thinking of are questions like, doesn't the priest need to be wearing his stole for your confession to be valid? Or like, well, if you get married outside, it's just like that can't ever be valid, right? Well, it can be if you have permission from the bishop, right? So that validity laicity distinction is, right, that's where that comes in, and it helps them to understand that. What is the most essential, as in, if this isn't present, then the sacrament doesn't happen, versus this is according to the law of the church. And yes, we should follow the law of the church in regards to the sacraments, but there are these things that if they're not done according to the law of the church, the sacrament still happens. So yeah, it's I do find that we're able to walk them through it, and I don't usually come across anybody saying, I just don't get it. This doesn't make any sense at all.
I think it really comes home too when you talk about the Eastern Rite. I mean, because some of the sacraments, the rite, the way they celebrate is very different, but we still recognize as valid. Like I have good friends who are Marianite Catholics, so Eastern Rite Catholics, and they receive I've been there when their child receives all three sacraments at once as an infant. And so, that can help them as well. They don't often think about that. I find most of my students have no experience of the Eastern Rite at all. I had one student last year who was Eastern Rite, and that was a real joy because she could explain some things from her perspective. She's like, yeah, my priest, he and his wife, they bake the Eucharistic bread for Mass the liturgy every week. Like that's pretty cool. Like to talk about and explain that to, my experience is 99.9% of my students in 4 years at Kolbe are Latin Rite. So that's kind of a nice thing to expose them to other ways of doing it that are valid. And recognized as such by the church.
Right. Yeah, I know when we tell them that in some of the Eastern rites of the church, in the Eucharistic prayers, we don't have the words of institution. We don't have Jesus saying, this is my body, this is my blood. That does break their brains for a second. They're like, wait, but how can that work? How can that be valid? And that does get a little bit of that magical thinking, but he didn't say the magic words.
Yeah.
Well, that ties in nicely to the next point I wanted to get your thoughts on, and that is how this sacramental theology that we were discussing, how it enriches both our spiritual lives and our classical homeschool approach that we're taking.
Well, I mean, for me, it helps us, I think, remind us that there's more to life than what we perceive. That the physical world can bring us into contact with spiritual realities. I think it's helpful to remind us of what sacraments do, not just for us, but to us. So for example, baptism, making us adopted sons and daughters of God, temples of the Holy Spirit, not in some figurative way, but in a literal way. St. Paul is not figuratively saying you are a temple of the Spirit, right? That the Spirit lives within you. I think that changes how you view yourself. I know when we talk about that with the students, it's like, oh, I never really thought about that. So I think, how would you treat a church? What would you say or do in a church? Do you do that in your family when you're engaging with other people who are also temples of the Spirit, which can help with family life, as well. I had a kid just the other day, 11th grader. He came on, we were doing our mic checks. He's like, can I ask you a question on mic? And I said, sure. And he's like, is it wrong of me to say I'm a son of God? I'm like, no. I'm like, the church wants you to tell people you are the son of God, right? Are you baptized? Yeah. Like, he didn't even have this understanding. He thought it was something wrong. And like, no, like, you are royalty. And if you're royalty, that should impact the way you view yourself and the way you view others. How would you speak to royalty? Well, that sibling in your household who you find really annoying, well, they're royalty as well, right? The person, I think that helps shape that. Also, I mean, you can go on and on with all the sacraments in regards to that, the Eucharist, marriage, all these things that we often don't fully realize what they do for us and to us, right? I always like to talk to the kids, and I think this is helpful in school settings as well. A lot of people, there's a certain group of theologians, they talk about the sacrament of your neighbor, because based on Christ, like in Matthew 25, when he talks about the whole conception of the separation of the sheep and the goats at the final judgment, is based on how they interacted with the least. What they did to the least or didn't do to the least, they did to him, right? That you encounter Christ through other people. And so I think that's really important for your own spiritual life. I think in regards to, we go as a family, we vacation, for lack of a better term, I don't know how else to describe it, with the Benedictines every year. We've done that for 24 years now. And part of Benedictine spirituality is treating the guest or the stranger as Christ, as if he's Christ in disguise. And so they really model it. And I think that's a really big thing, because you do meet a lot of people who are difficult or different than you, to see them as Christ in disguise. How would you treat this person? In a world that's so divided right now, in a country that's very divided, social media doesn't help. There's so many things where your instinct, I think, today is, I need to give an immediate reaction. I need to have a hot take on it. And you don't. You need to, like, if this person is Christ, how would you respond to them? And with schooling, as a homeschooling parent, I know we have those. I'd love to say every homeschool parent that we have wonderful days where we do nothing but we just love each other, and we learn Latin, and we hug each other and say, wasn't that great? And we high five and go to bed with smiles on our faces. But we know that's not the reality, right? We'd like it to be. So in those difficult moments when your kid just doesn't seem to be able to figure out what 4 times 4 is, and you're losing your mind as a parent, I think it's helpful to keep in mind, again, this person I'm dealing with, yes, this is stressful, but this is Christ right now for me. This is him in front of me here. And how am I going to channel my instincts and respond to them of whatever is best for them? So those are things, like, for me, that often come up in conversations with, because I do a lot of work with parents, right? When I'm doing sacramental prep, for example, and the kids themselves, I think those are some basic things, like, to recognize, like, the sacraments change you. And it's not just in the moment, but it's beyond that. Certain sacraments in particular, and that the person you meet mediates Christ to you as well, in a different way than the 7 sacraments, but still in a very real way, Christ himself tells us. So that's where I guess I would go with that.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, Brendan.
Mm-hmm.
I like to tell the students of this beautiful little phrase from St. Ambrose, that we meet Christ in the sacraments. It's short, but it's punchy, right? We come into contact with him. We receive his grace, and most especially, of course, in the Eucharist, where we receive him, where we receive not just grace, but the author of grace. I think, too, in terms of the classical education context, learning about the sacraments really fits well with that, because of the very structured and ordered way in which you can do it, right? So I lay out for the students, with each of these sacraments, we're going to talk about, what is it? What are its effects? How is it foreshadowed in the Old Testament? Where did Christ institute it? what are its form and matter, how is it celebrated, who can receive it, who can celebrate it. You can study for this so easily. Know those things, and you're going to know 90% of what you need to know on the test. Our classical way of educating, I think, helps. That form of education helps to train their minds to think in that kind of systematic way. And so it's nice to get to studying the sacraments and say, you're going to love this. It's going to fit so well. This is going to be right up your alley.
Let's dig a little deeper into the book itself. Talk us through sort of the timing of it and the role it has in the Kolbe curriculum, which we've hinted at, but build on that.
So this is my 9th year teaching with Kolbe. I was actually, the very first class I was hired to teach was the 10th grade course, which covers the sacraments. So generally we've done 9th grade is scripture, 10th grade is sacraments and early church history, 11th grade is apologetics and more church history, 12th grade is morality and even more church history. So at a certain point, a few years back, as you know, the school regularly will look at different courses and see whether anything needs a change or an amendment in a curriculum. They'll occasionally look at texts and see whether they need an adjustment or replacement. And they were discussing how the book that we were using for the 10th grade on the sacraments had been written almost 100 years ago, before the Second Vatican Council, before the revisions to the liturgy, the reforms to the liturgy after the council. And so there was some discussion of, well, we should look for a different text to use on the sacraments. And I said, "I'll write one." Kind of half joke, sort of like half joking, like, but would you, could I? To my great surprise, they said, "Yes, all right, go for it." So, at that point, I had been teaching the course for a number of years and had kind of a very clear idea in my head of what are the things I would want to cover, what are the kind of common questions that I get from the students each year on the different subjects within the sacraments, and so that's how I kind of ended up coming to write the book.
Yep. Okay. So what did your writing process look like then? Did it kind of come together quickly, or was it?
Yeah, it actually did come about pretty quickly. Again, because I had that very clear structure in my mind. All right, we're talking about baptism. Let's do institution, form, matter, all of that stuff. So having that kind of skeleton to hang everything on helped the writing of it to move pretty quickly.
I love both of those things. I mean, obviously, my wife Maggie works with curriculum, but one of the things and she had used the prior book, I believe one of the Father Lau books, when she had been teaching courses before, and ran into some of those areas of confusion because it's like, we don't do it this way anymore. But I also love that you've taught it for so long that you could anticipate the sorts of questions, that a reader would have, a student would have as they're coming into this. So rather than just waiting to answer or address those things, you could actually weave that into the new text too, which seems wonderful.
Yeah, and I guess another piece of that was that, so knowing that we would have the students read the catechism, the appropriate catechism paragraphs along with the text I was writing. I didn't really quote from the catechism in the book, but I would quote from all the other, magisterial documents and Thomas Aquinas and other church documents, just to give them more depth, rather than me just saying, "Let me throw all the quotes that you also had to read for your other reading." Just trying to give a greater depth and view of the tradition of the church on the sacraments.
Are you up for explaining the process that the book has undergone to arrive at its the imprimatur that it has, the nihil obstat, that whole process?
Yeah, sure. So any text of Catholic theology is supposed to, before it's printed and distributed, to receive ecclesiastical approval, right? So that the bishop of the place in which it's being printed should be able to approve and to say, yes, this is good, this is kosher, this is all as it should be. And so the process there is that you submit the text to the bishop's office, and the bishop will appoint a reviewer, or in Latin, a censor, but not a censor in the case of, like, redacting your text or anything like that, but a reviewer. Some dioceses have kind of an official censor librorum, censor of books, or sometimes the bishop will have to depute somebody. So let's say censor deputatus, which I always picture like a sheriff deputizing somebody when all the bad guys are coming into town. It's probably not. I doubt they get a badge or anything, but they should if they don't. Anyway, so so we submitted the book for review, and our reviewer went through the text and then sent it back to me with a number of comments in the text. And some of them were kind of questions, and some of them were suggestions for ways to make the text clearer. Luckily there were no accusations of heresy anywhere in there, but just little areas to tighten things up, to make it clearer, to make it it's one thing when you have the kind of book living in your head. Of course, everything's clear to you, but then when somebody else reads it, and you can realize, oh, maybe that wasn't as well said as I thought it was, or maybe that joke kind of fell flat, or it didn't come across. So the reviewer makes those suggestions and make amendments to the book and send it back, and then eventually the reviewer signs off on it, and then the bishop then gave his approval. So in the text, you'll see imprimatur with the bishop's name next to it, and that's let it be printed, or it may be printed. And nihil obstat, which means nothing stands in the way, nothing obstructs. And so that's the sort of theological certification that there's nothing heretical or opposed to the faith in the text. So, our students, our families can be assured that the text that we're using in class has been approved by the bishop for use.
Interesting. Appreciate the explanation of what the process is like. So it's been introduced to our 10th grade students. How has that been going so far?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is year 2 for us. We had to use it all like as a PDF version last year as we were finishing it up, but they've really enjoyed it. Like Nick was saying, the book we had before, you had to keep supplementing it. It was outdated. But one of the things, there were some strengths to it. I mean, one of the strengths of the Father Lowe book was he did a really good job of outlining the history of the development of the sacraments. So Nick maintains that in this book, which is a real strength of it, I think, to show the development and the progression of it. They didn't just fall out of the sky kind of a thing, how we got to where we're at. And it's a really, I've said this to Nick already, I think it's very well done. It's to the point, when you read it, the students appreciate that. We do so much reading. It's kind of like, it's one of these books that if I was going to highlight everything that was important, I'd almost end up highlighting the whole thing, which is a good sign that you've cut out a lot of the fat. Like as I get older, I realize when I'm reading books, there is a lot of fluff in some of them. And I had one of my professors when I was doing my graduate work who said to me, short books are better because the author has to focus on simplifying his argument. And I was like, oh, I never really thought of that before. And so I find the book, and I know the students really enjoy the book, to be straightforward, easy to understand, but comprehensive at the same time. You're not leaving anything out. You're not skipping over things. And they really enjoy it. I mean, in particular, there's a great chapter on the liturgy, which I think is extremely helpful, for the students. I mean, it's a joy to teach. And I'm not just saying that because I work for Nick. That's true that it is a joy to teach. It's a really good book. And I'm just thrilled. I have one of the original first copies, which is a collector's item now. So it's great to have an actual physical copy that I can give to the students and they can have in their hands here. But it's really well done. And, Kolbe did a really good job of publishing it, frankly, too. I said to Nick, as soon as I got it, I was like, this is really good paper. Like, they actually put some really good care into this. They care about this book. And I think that comes across to the students as well. It's like, it gives it substance, but it's an excellent book to teach from. And I didn't tell Nick this, but I used it in my class in the parish this weekend, and they don't know who Nick is. So I didn't say who, this is Mr. Senz or whatever, but my other students are very impressed. They're like, Mr. Senz, he teaches here? And it's like, yeah, this is Mr. Senz. And it's almost like in their voice, could he come and teach us this? It's like, hey man, let's slow down. All right. but no, it's a great book. It's been very well received by the students, and it's as a teacher, and if you're a parent listening, and you're doing something in the parish or something as well, which I know a lot of parents do, it's a really good resource you could easily apply to a parish setting for creating lessons or OCIA or these kinds of things.
Yeah, I've actually used it as well in teaching OCIA classes at the parish I work at, which it's awkward teaching from a book that you wrote. It feels, as the author, very wise and handsome man said, but on the other hand, I did the work putting it together, might as well use it. Right? So I've found that people in the parish have appreciated the background information, the historical information, the way that everything's kind of put together and presented. So yeah, I've found that myself, and I've heard that from other people that have read it, that they've just themselves been able to enjoy it and found it useful in helping to understand the sacraments better.
I had that experience with my daughter who was in your class last year, Nick, and she was every time after class she usually comes down and talks to me about what they discussed and things. But it was always fun because I've studied some of the stuff myself, but she was usually introducing something new that I hadn't either known or thought about as well. So even though I've considered that I'm fairly knowledgeable, she was bringing up things that were new or that I hadn't thought about, which was a lot of fun, a lot of good conversations coming out of that.
That's great. That's very gratifying to hear.
We got to visit with some of the folks from the Kolbe publishing team on a recent episode. We'll link that in the notes. It was great to hear them talk about their process of bringing the book to life in book form, and the paper choices and the design and everything like that. So we've linked that.
Yeah, I really like too that this was brought together in the way that it was, because just like we were talking about it, it's, yes, you said it's made for this 10th grade course where we're going to be doing, but as you've just both explained, it's also good for anybody who wants to study the sacraments, or any church that wants to pick this up. You've got a new, thorough, clear text that can be used, which is just a great resource beyond the Kolbe walls. I love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so how about we broaden out a little bit? You each teach several grades of Kolbe theology, high school level, and your dads, and teach in the parish settings and so forth. So let's talk about Kolbe's religion and theology studies, academic and relational aspects. And that kind of came up already in the conversation a bit. What comes to mind at this point?
I know Brendan, I'm going to put him on the spot here. He teaches at every level in the high school, so I think he's a great one to speak to the overall curriculum there.
I mean, I think the curriculum is very logically aligned. I think that's great. You start with the Old Testament and you move forward from there. I think it's well designed in the sense that each year builds off of the previous year. We recently just kind of redid Theology 9 and Theology 10, Nick's book being part of that. And now there's a really good flow on that. You spend a little bit more time in the Old Testament in 9th grade, kind of get into New Testament by the end. But then in 10th grade, this allows us, the new format allows us to spend more time in all the scriptures and try to fit all in one year. It overflows into the first semester of 10th grade, where we do the New Testament. We started a little bit at the end of 9th grade, but you really go in depth. And then one of the things I love about the 10th grade curriculum is you finish up the scriptures, and then you go right into church documents, writings from people who lived and knew the apostles, and we have their writings. Like, I think sometimes kids think of the scriptures as existing almost like in fairy tale land or Robin Hood or something. Like, they don't realize, like, these are real people in real times, and here's other people who knew these guys. So, you go into Clement of Rome, and writing in the 1st century, or the Didache from the 1st century, and you have Ignatius of Antioch, and Irenaeus, who knew Polycarp, and Polycarp knew St. John, and these kind, like, it's also, I think that makes a real impression on students, seeing how, like, I try to say, here's the link in the chain. Like, here's Jesus. Now here's the next link is John, and the next link is Polycarp. Here's the next link is Irenaeus. Like, this continuation through history, I think, is really great, which then leads into the sacraments in the second half of the year in the liturgy, which also, because we do see hints of that in the which is a great place for it because we just read the New Testament where the sacraments are kind of, in the text, but also we see in those early Christian writings that we discuss in class, for example, Justin Martyr describes the liturgy. When he describes the liturgy in the early, 2nd century, in the order of it, it's the exact same order we have now. And that makes a real impression on people as we head into that conversation. And then you get into, more apologetics and explaining the thing. I think there's a real good flow to it. It's not just haphazard. In regards to like the relational aspect of it, I think part of that is I think kids, and we have a really good culture here at Kolbe. I mean, the kids, I think, feel comfortable asking questions they wouldn't necessarily ask other, people in their parish, or, I think I find anyway, students are not afraid to ask questions and feel like they're going to be judged by asking the question, or like, oh, I should have known that, or these kinds of things. I think there's a real curiosity that the students have, and that they feel comfortable asking their questions, and that, there's no such thing as a dumb question. I think they truly have that. And as a teacher, I'm sure Nick is the same way. I try to bring in little things of like my own experience of trying to live these things out, or, that kind of thing, to show how it would, my experience, what it looks like in flesh, and I think people then open up and share for them too, right? What this looks like, and things that they struggle with and that they just need more clarification, or things that they find really life-giving in the material in their own lives, and they share that. I mean, there's some wonderful things that students will say about their own faith life and how these things connect with it, that then gets a whole other conversation going. But yeah, it's a really tight curriculum that I think encourages people to share their faith and feel free to ask questions. And some of the best classes, you go down these rabbit holes where I have to like keep an eye on the clock and be like, I still have 20 slides to get to and like 6 minutes to go. But I don't want to I have this, I don't want to just ignore it, and I always want to come back, and they do ask questions sometimes I never even thought of before, which is always exciting for me to like, what, I've said before, I think even in one of our podcast meetings, like I don't make up an answer. Like if I don't know the answer, I will find it out. So it's always great to have to do a little homework myself as a teacher. That's the kind of, interaction with the curriculum that our student has, that it spurs new questions for them.
Yeah, I keep a Q&A pod open in all of my classes. And I tell the students, if you have a theological question, even if it has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, put it in there, because either we can talk about it when we have some extra time, or I might just stop class and say, you know what, that's a good question. Let's take 2 minutes on it. Like today, we're talking in Theology 9 about the book of Isaiah. Someone put in a question about purgatory. I said, this is a good question. Let's take 2 minutes, review quick. What is purgatory? What's its place within our eternal destiny? And I always tell the students, I want to answer the questions that you have, and not spend time necessarily on things you're not wanting to know as much about. The book of Habakkuk is a book of scripture and is the inspired word of God. But also, if they have other questions about the sacraments, about the moral life that they need to know about that day, we could talk about that too. So I think that's all, that mindset is all part of wanting to help our students grow in their faith, right? This isn't a religious studies course where we are just learning interesting factoids about this religion called Catholicism. We're trying to help inculcate faith in them and to help them grow in their faith. And answering their questions about their faith is a big part of that.
I come to know it well. Thinking about the time of year, we're recording this in early February, not quite to Lent yet. This will air during Lent, and shortly thereafter is Easter season, during which time many sacraments are celebrated. Some thoughts on the term I think of as sacrament season. I don't know how, I don't mean to sound glib about it, but it also is fitting in some respects. So thoughts on that as we're approaching that.
I think that's an entirely appropriate term. Yeah, it gets the point across, and I love it. I feel so blessed to be leading the OCIA programs and leading people through this process of either becoming Christians, right, seeking baptism, or coming into full communion with the Catholic Church, and seeing the joy that brings them, and getting to be there with them, and when they receive their sacraments and now begin this life of living the Catholic faith, I feel very privileged to get to walk with people in that, and to see the transformation that happens in their lives in that time.
I think a big thing with confirmation students, also, like I don't work with the first communion students, but I see them all the time. We're a small parish. I think to not just get wrapped up in the day that you're preparing for and all the things that go in that, getting a suit, getting a dress, making sure you have a restaurant for the reception afterwards, like all that stuff, I think becomes like the priority for a lot of people, and not to lose sight of what the heck it is we're doing, like why we're doing this. Why are you getting dressed up? Why are you making these special plans? And the focus on the sacrament itself, right? And the essential aspect of the sacrament, and that's what makes this day special. So I always try to drive that home, gently, of course. It's interesting because in a parish setting, you have a wide variety of kids who come for these sacraments. Some of them are at mass every week. Some of them, the parents never take them. They drop them off and drive away. So you're catechizing very different categories of children and their families. So, if you're involved in parish life or anything like that, I would always say, try to lead by example. Don't try to guilt people or things like that, but have good conversations with them and get them excited for the sacrament, that the sacrament is the thing. And if you have a child right now who's getting ready for one of the sacraments, the party's going to be great no matter what, but make them excited for the day, for the sacrament itself, and that's the focus, and that's this thing they're getting ready to celebrate. And then you're off to a pretty good start.
All right. Any final thoughts or takeaways at this point in our conversation?
I would just say if you're listening and you feel like you want to get stronger in your knowledge of the sacrament, get Nick's book. Yeah. Because it's a great, and I mean that in all seriousness, it's a great introduction, and it's very user friendly and accessible. And like we said before, it can be used in all sorts of settings: private, personal reading, leading things. I know a lot of people do like book groups or these kinds of things during Lent in parishes. It could be a great resource for that. The sacraments, they're so intimately tied with the season of Lent and preparation for Easter, right? In the vigil and stuff. So I think that could be a great time. Just to remind people, even like we're cradle Catholics, like why are people going through all this stuff to come into the church on Easter vigil? Like, to remind ourselves of, when you've been Catholic your whole life, there are, like I said before, you take things for granted. You do. And there's a reason you see this joy on the people's faces who come in on the vigil, and to try to reclaim some of that joy for yourself by reminding yourself like, oh yeah, like, oh, I didn't realize that, that Lent coming upon us is a great time to do that, to take time to deepen your own understanding, knowledge, appreciation, and reception of the sacraments.
Yeah, that's well said, Brendan. I feel awkward saying to anyone, go read my book. I could never do a book tour or anything like that, heaven forbid, but I don't get any royalties if you buy my book. So, but I really enjoyed getting to write it. I'm enjoying getting to teach it. I just love teaching about the sacraments, talking about the sacraments, participating in the sacraments. They're such a beautiful part of our faith. And, when, again, working with people who are coming into the church, that's always something that they really enjoy. It becomes one of their favorite parts of being Catholic, is not just like going to a church service where you're hearing a pastor talk for a while, and maybe they have a skit or a show, or like someone once told me about, they did a Noah's Ark thing and they had all kinds of zoo animals there, and like, that's great. We have Jesus. We have Jesus here present with us. You can hear Jesus forgiving you of your sins. You can receive his consolation when you are seriously ill. It's a great reminder to myself of the beautiful grace that we've been given in this gift of the sacrament.
You started out telling us about like how you begin your course, but whenever I'm thinking about the sacraments, for me at least, I've just, especially when you look at the institution of each of the sacraments, it's like an introduction into eternity, it seems to me, because like the first time I was told, at Jesus's baptism was when he instituted the sacrament of baptism. And it's like, wait, he didn't die and be resurrected at that point. So how could that happen? Or the Mass, that we're not celebrating death after death after death of Jesus. It's one event, and it's one of the best ways for me to think about eternity and this other reality that I can't really fathom, of course, at this point, or completely understand, but to be introduced to that and see that this is a lot bigger than just even this routine that we go through. But
so the book is available in the Kolbe bookstore. We'll have a link to that in our show notes. So we'll send folks there. We'll have links to the episodes that these guys have been on before and other episodes that relate to the conversation. It's been great to see you guys again. I always enjoy having you come in to visit with us, and we'll look forward to the next time you're back. So thanks again for being here today.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.